Welcome to the virtual rebroadcast of PubK's 2024 Government Contracts Annual Review. During this week, we are presenting 14 panel discussions featuring more than 70 expert practitioners, as well as 2 in-depth conversations with key government officials. PubK publishes news and insights for the government contracts community, such as PubK Protests and Claims, PubK Cybersecurity and Data Privacy, and PubK Compliance and Enforcement. In addition to our annual review, we also host webinars, podcasts, and in-person networking meetings during the year. If you'd like to learn more about PubK, visit us online at pubkgroup.com. All of this week's presentations were recorded live at our in-person conference in February at the Ronald Reagan International Trade Center. You can join any or all of these sessions during the week using the same link and password you use today. All attendees will be in listen-only mode. Your video will remain disabled through the entire session. Many of our panelists are joining us today to answer questions about their presentations. Enter your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and the panel will address as many as possible during the webinar. If time allows, we'll open up a live Q&A session after the video presentation. Our briefing book, which includes all of this week's slide presentations and other materials, are available for download from the PubK website. We are applying for continuing legal education CLE approval in Virginia, California, Texas, Florida, Colorado, and Kansas. While we cannot guarantee approval, we expect acceptance within the next few weeks. We will notify all attendees when those approvals have been received. If you received CLEs for our in-person event, you can apply for additional CLEs for panels that you may have missed. And finally, if you are interested in obtaining CLE, please look for our poll question during the presentation. The state boards require us to verify your participation during the event. The poll is a simple yes/no question. We will keep track of all responses to verify that you viewed the panel. If you do not wish to obtain CLE credit, you can disregard the poll. This conference would not have been possible without the strong support of our event sponsors, all of whom are listed on the next few slides. Our sponsors also provided speakers for our event and other valuable input. We encourage you to review the strengths and capabilities of these firms and to reach out to them directly with any questions you may have. And now we present our next panel, Mergers and Acquisitions.
We're excited to be here for the Mergers and Acquisitions panel. Hopefully we'll be an insightful 45 minutes. We've got 38 slides to get through in our 45 minutes, so you're doing the math, we're going to talk fast. But you've got the material in your books, and we'll of course hang around for questions afterwards. But real quick, this is what we're going to try to cover in our 45 minutes. Hopefully, we tried to structure the presentation as a bit of a kind of jumping around the panel, so you're just not hearing from one voice all the time. Like I said, if we could wait for questions at the end, that'd be great. And we've tried to structure it with issues, kind of thinking pre-signing, and then also post-closing issues that pop up and things that we see in our practice. So with that, intros, my name is Todd Overman. I'm the chair of the government contracts practice at Bass, Berry & Sims. Been working in this space, in this community for over 20 years now, and have really enjoyed it. I'm up here with Brad Jorgensen at DLA Piper, longtime friend and colleague, and someone that we've worked across the table and sometimes on the same side of the table together on deals over the years, so it's great to be with Brad. Cy Alba, who I've also had the opportunity to work with, mostly in the protest space. Maybe we'll do some deals together at some point in time, Cy. But great to have Cy up here as well. And then Travis, who I haven't had a chance to work with, but really excited to hear from Travis today on a couple of different issues. So to jump into it, last year we had a banker on the panel. I guess the bankers just grow tired of hearing from government contract attorneys, so we didn't get a banker this year. So I'm playing the role of a banker, which I'm not a banker. But I do think it's important to kind of set the stage of what we saw in 2023. There's some of you in this room may have worked on some of these transactions. There were a number of interesting kind of high-profile transactions. In 2023, I think you really saw private equity dominate the space. Several of these are involving private equity acquisitions with all the capital they deployed and still to deploy in 2024. From a deal volume perspective, I always like to cite the source of where I get this information from. Many of us probably have access to HireGov, which is a consolidation database of public data, and they actually have a M&A transactions kind of ticker that they track. And so this is a fairly broad view of deals in our space. And as you can see, we really kind of reached an apex in 2021 and have slowly come down. Now I think the numbers in 2023 were lower than 2022, likely a lot in part due to the rate issues and interest rates. But if you looked at the back half of 2023, you saw rates really pick up steam. And I think based upon the deal volume we were talking about in the green room, the deals are definitely happening. I'm sure some of you are working on some now as well. Just real quickly, some trends that we saw in 2023, and I'll welcome my panelists' views on this when I get to their portions. As I mentioned, private equity is increasingly involved in our space, whether it's establishing new platforms or adding on to existing platforms. You're seeing them move into different areas all the time. And they're analyzing these areas and looking forward to not only where the government's spending money, but also where technology and this industry is going. So I think you're not going to see private equity go away, you only see them increase. What you did see kind of decrease is the major defense primes. They have not been as active in regards to large acquisitions as they might have been 5-10 years ago. Some of that may just be to the rate, some of it may just be where capital is being deployed, and some of it may be increased DOJ scrutiny on consolidation in the marketplace. We saw a number of smaller deals in 2023 requiring less leverage, a lot of that from the PE space, but also from where dollars were available and flowing into smaller deals. And then lastly, there's always seems to be kind of a new thing in terms of what folks are investing in. It seemed that, look at the deals in 2023, these were expanding kind of technical capabilities, AI, machine learning, all the kind of hot new topics. But the deals I was involved in 2023 involved kind of old line technology. So I think there's still people looking at things even in the old space to make sure that they've consolidated and grown in the right areas. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brad to kick us off on some pre-signing issues to think about.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, I think most of us are familiar with the idea that consummation of an M&A transaction, where the target company is a small business, that will likely render you an affiliate due to majority equity position. But one thing that is a little bit surprising for a buyer is to learn that even in advance of closing, there could be affiliation concerns. The SBA regulations are knotty. It provides several grounds for affiliation, one of which is obviously equity ownership, but there are many others that are to be considered under the totality of circumstances test. And under the present effect rule, the SBA regulations provide that an agreement to merge will be given present effect. And so on the next slide, we talk a little bit more about that. The question becomes, what is an agreement to merge and when is it triggered? So a transaction typically kicks off with submission of a letter of intent, an LOI, and that LOI will detail all sorts of framework type ideas, timing, exclusivity, confidentiality, things of that nature. An LOI will constitute an agreement to merge when it, according to the SBA regulations, includes definitive agreement on a variety of terms. And so to the extent the LOI is simply an agreement to negotiate, an agreement to further discuss the transaction, it's not going to trigger affiliation. To the extent it includes definitive terms on a variety of different topics, the risk certainly arises that there could be pre-closing affiliation between the buyer and the seller. And so as a practice point, to the extent the parties do not want to trigger affiliation in advance of closing, which obviously is a big deal, they need to be very thoughtful in the wording they use in their LOI, that it need to be much more along the lines of this is an agreement to discuss and to negotiate and to explore a transaction, and much less an agreement as to definitive terms, including pricing, whatever the case might be. Who's talking about this one?
That side.
All right, there you go.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, so kind of moving on from the LOI piece, there's some other pre-sale issues that come up, specifically when you're talking about buying 8A companies, or even a company, I've had it come up where you have a large business now, but they've still got legacy 8A work because they've grown organically. If there's legacy 8A work, or if they have any 8A contracts, you have to submit a waiver to SBA before you close the transaction. So just remember the timing on that. There is no specific rule as to when exactly you're supposed to do it. SBA tends to like to have some time. I think we did one a few years ago where it was like right before we closed, and I think SBA yelled at us a little bit saying, why didn't you give us more time? But the answer was because the reg doesn't say we have to. And so you have these situations that come up where you don't know when the closing is going to be, you don't know how quickly you're going to be able to get this waiver out, but it has to be submitted before closing. And if the waiver is denied, the contract's supposed to be terminated for convenience. So that's always a major risk factor. There are certain things you can do. I've had we were talking about private equity, I've had a number of private equity clients come in, or people who are starting new funds who want to avoid these affiliation problems or avoid these issues. And in theory, you could take a minority interest, and there's other things you'd have to worry about with negative control, meaning controlled by a minority investor. But there are ways to avoid having to go through with this, but the general rule is that you have to submit this waiver request to SBA. In the past, they used to sit on these things for almost an indefinite period of time. They're getting better about getting back to you. And we'll get into this more later, I think, with novations, but certain vehicles out there, procurement vehicles, like STARS 3, if someone has a STARS 3, they are coming back. The agency is not novating or agreeing to things until they hear back from SBA. So if you're doing asset transactions, this can be a larger risk than in other transactions. The other thing when you're dealing with WOSB or STVOSB or 8A, you have to deal with the ownership rules. It has to be direct ownership. So it comes up in certain circumstances, I think we might be going into this, certain circumstances where you're trying to do investments in companies, you might be reorganizing the company or bringing it under a certain category or certain body of entities that's doing the acquisition. And you're creating it so that it's now owned by another business. And even if that holding company is 100% owned by the woman or the veteran or whatever, you still blow the status. So this comes up pretty frequently when you do F reorganizations. If entities are an S corporation, you're trying to do investments, which is where some of these issues come up as well. If you're dealing with investments, you have to also think about some of these FCA issues. If you're buying the whole company or if you're just investing in it, you can still have liability. So are there affiliation issues, which we were talking about before? If a company was affiliated and they were a large business, or if they were in a mentor-protege relationship, they were the mentor, and they were controlling their joint ventures too much. These are things that can come up and create problems. I've even had false claim defense cases where the Department of Justice has raised issues with mentors. For instance, they were going to assist with proposal preparation. That's the language in the mentor-protege agreement. It was approved by SBA. This company, this mentor, wrote the proposal in 2 out of like the 15 or 20 contracts they went after. Because they wrote the proposal, DOJ didn't think that was assistance. They thought it was doing it for them, and that SBA didn't approve that kind of assistance with proposal writing. And that turned into an FCA issue. DOJ agreed that it was only the 2 contracts. After that, the protege was trained to do it correctly. They did it on their own, or with assistance, with true assistance, for the rest of their 15 or so contracts. Those weren't a problem, but the first 2 were an issue. So this takes a little bit more digging into when you're doing diligence on companies. How did they actually run themselves, not what's on the piece of paper? So asking those kinds of questions. If you're dealing with things with like an S corp, that's also where what I was getting into before. If you're buying an S corporation or you're a mentor buying a 40% interest in your protege, this becomes a major issue. And you can't do F reorganizations because then it blows your status if it's 8A, woman-owned, or service-abled vet. So if you are a mentor or you're looking for a mentor, and part of the deal is that they want, or you want them to buy, a 40% equity stake in your company. If you're an S corporation, whether if you made any S election, you're an LLC, corp, whatever you are, if you've made the S election, if they invest in you directly, it can blow the S status, which cause a bunch of tax problems. So it's something to talk about up front. If the protege is willing to accept those consequences, fine. But you can run into problems if you do an F reorganization because of the way the structure works. You put a holding company, you blow your status. So you save taxes, but you destroy the small business status.
Which could be the value of the transaction, is the ability to compete in the small pool and receive those revenues.
Right. And that's especially true if you're a mentor. If you're a mentor, you're trying to do probably joint ventures with each other and go after small business work. Whereas if you buy into some entity and you do an F reorganization and they're no longer service-able vet, let's say, but your entire JV is set up to be service-able vet and that's the pipeline, you've just defeated your entire purpose. So just things to think about there. With HubZone, it doesn't matter because the ownership is allowed to be indirect. So you could even have a situation where you've got a company that's 8A that could have a subsidiary that's HubZone, and you could mentor protege or whatever with that subsidiary, buy into the subsidiary, and you know, it'll still work out. You won't blow the HubZone status necessarily, but with other statuses that require direct ownership, it can be a problem. The other thing that we'll go through, recertification. So if you buy a company, within 30 days of the acquisition, or technically if you screw up on the LOI, within 30 days of your agreement in principle, you have to recertify your status as whatever it is. SBA is going to consolidate this regulation. Probably in the next 6 months we'll get a proposed rule, something like that is what I heard, where they're going to take the current recertification rule and try to streamline it to clarify that it's a recertification of size and status, not just size or not just status. So once you hit that and you have to recertify, if you're a small business, or let's say you're a small business that graduated recently, so you have legacy small business contracts, but you're large now. You want to increase your capabilities, you buy another company, you buy all their stock, or you merge them into yourself. The recertification rule says you have to recertify on all their work that you bought and all of your own. If you just buy assets, you have to just recertify on the contracts that are coming over via the novation process. So it's likely better if you're in that situation to do an asset transaction as opposed to a stock transaction. There are also ways to get around this. If you do something like convertible debt, you could buy a minority interest, you could have convertible debt for the rest of the business, and if it's structured correctly, you could kind of kick that can down the road. But you have to be very careful because just like with the LOI issues, if you trigger the present effect rule because that 51% that's convertible debt, say, automatically converts in 5 years or something like that, that can be given present effect. You'll be treated as having that 51% the day you sign that document. So it has to be structured correctly in order to kind of kick this recertification can down the road a little bit. But SBA did formally clarify now that a minority interest doesn't trigger this rule. So you can take a minority interest without triggering the recertification rule. But because of this redo of this entire regulation, kind of stay tuned. We'll see what they change. If they make more changes or a major overhaul, you could have other issues. Because the way I read it right now also is it's triggered if a concern acquires or is acquired by another concern, not necessarily if a natural person does the acquisition. So there's sort of a loophole there. I'm not sure if they're going to try to close that. I've talked to SBA a couple times about it, and they don't seem too bothered by it. But we'll see what they do, so stay tuned for that as well. Let's see. The 180-day rule, this is also an interesting one. So if you have outstanding proposals and you're acquired, or you acquire a company that has outstanding proposals, if the proposal was submitted more than 180 days prior to the closing and you recertify as large, the company can keep the contract, but the agency can't take small business credit for it anymore. If it's within that 180 days that the closing occurs, they're not eligible for that contract if you certify as other than small or not the right status. So you can lose those bids. So you have to make sure that you're timing things correctly. However, if you do it at the 181st day, it's likely, and you announce the acquisition, let's say, it's likely that a competitor is going to say, wait a minute, when did this really happen? Was there an LOI that was an agreement in principle, like we were talking about? And then file a size protest arguing that that agreement in principle occurred 2 months, 3 months, 5 months, 6 months ago, and so you were affiliated then. So you need to be paying attention to what bids are outstanding, how big of a deal is it, how critical is it that you have these bids, because you could lose them. You don't have to tell the agency they can't take credit, though, when you recertify. So think about that, too. Like, what are you going to say to the agency when you recertify? Can you recertify and say that you're other than small now, but we look forward to still working with you, we can still be a team member, we can still bid on things, all that kind of language. Also, arguably, if you have a GSA schedule and you're doing any sort of recertification on it, the way the rule is structured now, the agency can't take credit, but you can still get options. So the way I read that is that in theory, you could continue to stay on a GSA schedule for like 20 years as a small business, legally. Practically speaking, though, they're going to flip that switch inside of eBuy and the systems, and you're not going to see the small business work anymore, so it's probably going to go away. And I'm not aware of any case that's tested that theory completely yet, but it's come up a few times, and I think folks have decided not to pursue it. So that's that. Should we go somebody else, or?
Great. Thanks. I think we've already kind of touched on affiliation, and we talked some of the affiliation 101 issues. I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about JV due diligence. You know, the many of us in this room have probably been involved in helping a company with a mentor-protege agreement. It's been around since 2016. It's, I think, been a very interesting and developing program. And I think we're really beginning to see the world of joint ventures that are flowing from those mentor-protege agreements. I mean, nearly every day I'm reading about a new JV either winning a standalone contract or winning an IDIQ. And they are, so I'm beginning to see in the last probably 18 to 24 months is that these joint ventures are now part of an acquisition. They're either, if you represent a mentor, they've got a stake in a JV, or if you're representing a protege, you know, they've got an interest in a JV. So kind of building this mentor-protege due diligence into your kind of overall diligence framework, I think is very important. Just some basics on this program. You know, the JVs are, you know, informal joint ventures, they're partnerships. I think we're traditionally seeing that you're going to be looking at an LLC, and I think as many of us know, they can't be populated, and they can only have, you know, certain employees to perform administrative functions. You know, one of the first things that I do when I see a joint venture is you want to start and dig into the operating agreement, and you want to see, and you know, who wrote it, and if there's a government contracts firm on the other side or in the notice provision, I feel pretty confident that it was written appropriately. But oftentimes they may not have gotten government contract counsel involved, and the operating agreement may not track the regs in the way that it should. There are, you know, specific provisions that are required to be in the operating agreement. Sometimes you see an operating agreement alongside a joint venture agreement, so you may see two documents. I tend to always just do one document with a chart up front to identify, you know, where the provisions are in the operating agreement. But it's really important to spend time digging into this operating agreement to make sure that the parties have actually followed the rules of the road and they haven't effectively created a problem in how they drafted the operating agreement. Because that you wouldn't know there was a problem in that until someone challenged via a size protest. There is no you know, formal approval process, except now the one instance in the sole source 8A world. But there's no formal approval process of this joint venture, and so unless it's challenged, it can remain kind of untested in regards to how the operating agreement is drafted. Similarly, need to be look for the unwritten rules about negative control. There are specific negative control provisions that, whether they be in a purchase agreement or in a JV agreement, may come to light, and you need to be careful about those so that again, you're not triggering those upon buying into that joint venture. There should also be a specific section, I think, about an addendum for each particular contract. I've run into that issue with clients recently where they have failed to basically put together the addendum as required, and may have survived in the sense that no one challenged that. But that's an important thing to also look for, is make sure that there's addendums to the operating agreement for each of the contracts that hopefully the JV has won. To the extent that the JV is performing work, this was mentioned a little bit by Cy earlier on limitation of subcontracting, but it's really important to focus in and look to see how the work is being performed and whether the Mentor Protege JV is actually meeting not only the limitation on subcontracting requirements, but also the 60/40 performance of work requirements. There are various certifications that have to be made and based upon the type of contract that's received. And you really need to make sure that the JV has a sense as to how they're performing the work and what certifications the JV has made. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Travis. He can take us through some select topics.
Thanks, Todd. So obviously we've covered a lot of particular areas of focus for diligence, but just to cover just a few more, I'm going to run through a few that we've kind of seen either taken on importance later or just are always important and always a big deal and deserve maybe a little bit more attention. First, just digging into sort of supply chain risk. So this is something where I think a lot of times people tend to focus on customer agreements because those are the big item that people are concerned about. Are there change of control? Are there consent requirements? But sometimes people don't put quite as much focus on the supplier agreements, and it can be a major risk item. So one of the things obviously you want to do first of all is look at your top suppliers list, make sure you got all the agreements in there that are posted in the data room. You want to be looking at the representations that are made. Are there appropriate flow downs? There's a lot of things that can come back to bite you. Make sure that there's appropriate like anti-trafficking provision, things like that are really important when you're dealing with various suppliers and consultants. One of the things also to keep in mind is you want to, because of some of these restrictions, for example, like covered telecommunications equipment, which applies, they look at whether you have included this equipment anywhere in your business. So it's important to also look at sort of IT procurement practices just broadly, not even specific to government contracts, but across the organization, to make sure that they're appropriately taking into consideration whether or not these type of products are being included. When they go to purchase. You want to look at just procurement practices generally. How do they go about engaging and vetting subcontractors? How do they go about looking at their vendors and determining whether or not they're appropriate? One particular area that obviously has become more important lately, appears to be a bipartisan issue, is sourcing from China. There are, several FAR, DFARS provisions that relate specifically to, obtaining products from China. I just mentioned that the covered telecommunications equipment, but this has taken on great importance. Some of you may have been tracking that the most recent National Defense Authorization Act included a new Section 805 that sort of takes some of what they're doing with the covered telecommunications equipment and applying it more broadly to this list of communist Chinese military companies that the government has essentially been tracking since 1999. And so they're just adding more and more potential entities to that list that you need to look for and check whether or not you're potentially sourcing from these companies. Another major area of focus is sort of forced labor risk. You've got the Uyghurs over there in China are producing these products. Solar panels in particular are a major area of concern. But you want to just see, they tend to, sort of whitewash these products by going through other countries. So you need to ultimately vet where are these products ultimately coming from. And if the target entity is a manufacturer that incorporates things like batteries, solar cells, things like that, it's a particular area that you have to dig into. Another thing, obviously, that's taken on greater prominence lately is sort of domestic preference issues, the ratcheting up the thresholds for components. They're up to 65% now. It's going to keep going up. So it just goes up every year. So you need to look at whether or not the company is appropriately, meeting its sourcing obligations under the Buy American Act, the Trade Agreements Act, and determining whether or not these products would comply. Digging into cybersecurity, given the emphasis on things like the CMMC, cybersecurity maturity model certifications that are sort of upcoming and could potentially have significant impact. There's a DOJ task force that's particularly looking at these issues. It's important to dig in and make sure that the company has the appropriate infrastructure in place to deal with the particular requirements that apply to government contractors. Things you want to look at, obviously, is the system security plan. You want to look at whether they have a plan of action and milestones. This is in comparison against the NIST 800-171 requirements. Where are they with respect to that? They're going to have to ultimately certify to it, make sure that they're tracking it, they're well on the way towards compliance. The DFARS provision, DFARS 252-204-7012, has been in place for many years, which has essentially required these NIST 800-171 requirements. So you would think that the contractor should be well along the way, especially to the extent that they have defense contracts, but that's just not always the case. And so you want to see what the gaps are and make sure they're tracking them and dealing with them appropriately. Another thing sometimes we see is for organizations that have both government contracts and also commercial contract profiles, that they're appropriately maintaining walls in place to keep controlled and classified information, secured information, within sort of the federal government contracting enclave within their IT system, to the extent that there's spillovers, it can cause major issues. Moving on to sort of mandatory disclosures. This is always something that you're always going to look into, but it's a very important issue and one that you should continue to look into. But one thing I just wanted to highlight at the front is, mandatory disclosure is sort of the end. That means that, you've already discovered, there's already been something that's done, and, potentially you're already looking at either False Claims Act or suspension and debarment or dealing with those potential risks. But it starts much earlier, right? So you don't start with just, okay, is there mandatory disclosure? You start with, has there been internal investigations? Has there been any voluntary disclosures? Is there anything else that you want to look at early? Maybe you're earlier along in the chain. You haven't gotten to the mandatory disclosure point, but it could become a mandatory disclosure later. Another thing to keep in mind is that, in a lot of cases, you can discover issues that may require a mandatory disclosure during the course of due diligence. This happens all the time. I mean, things as simple as, hey, you're looking in SAM at someone's registration and noticing that they have, represented small business, that they're a small business, and clearly, there's no way that they should be making that representation. And suddenly you're in a place where, how do I deal with this? What are we going to have to do as the transaction moves forward? And so this is something that has to be considered carefully. We look at the mandatory disclosure rule. There's actually two sort of sources of mandatory disclosure requirements. One is obviously the FAR provision that's included in contracts, which deals with both violation of federal criminal law involving things like fraud, conflict of interest, bribery, and gratuity violations, also Civil False Claims Act issues. But the contractor past performance, and the FAR 9.405 provisions specifically tracks the suspension and debarment requirements, and it particularly includes another additional source of potential mandatory disclosure, which is significant overpayments. So just keep that in mind, that it's not just what's in the FAR provision, it's also what's in FAR 9.405, and there may be that significant overpayment requirement for mandatory disclosure as well. I just also like to emphasize that to the extent that something is discovered, during the course of diligence, that it's important to, get early engagement with the suspending and debarring official. You don't want something to just go into the OIG's office and just leave it there. You want to be proactive. You want to have engagement. You want to get ahead of the issues. To the extent that there's an active False Claims Act, suit or settlement, you want there to be engagement with the SDO concurrently at the same time to try to resolve those issues so there's not an issue going forward. Talking about security clearances, so obviously, if you're dealing with someone that has a facility clearance, you want to vet that carefully to make sure that they have the appropriate policies and procedures in place to meet those controls. You want to check whether or not they're keeping classified materials on site at the facility. You want to look at their DD-254. That will tell you the specific, classified information requirements that are flowing down with respect to particular contracts. You want to also check whether they are appropriately excluding higher tier entities. Now, we see this a lot in particular where you have sort of private equity investment, people coming in. Sometimes when there has been an earlier transaction, you just want to make sure that they have done everything they need to sort of exclude higher tier entities from having access to classified information. And this means the appropriate board resolutions, that they've got the appropriate controls in place to make sure that they've handled that appropriately. You also want to look at the SF-328 filings. You want to look at their certificate pertaining to foreign interest to see whether or not there is foreign interests that need to be mitigated. You want to check their reporting communications with the DCSA and look at their key management personnel. Are there any issues there? Did the key management personnel have the appropriate clearances? And just keep in mind that there could be changes to those key personnel that will need to be reported in connection with the transaction. So then, moving on to the actual reporting. So if you have an entity with a facility clearance, you want to give sort of a heads up to the ISR. Now, this is a little bit, some people have different views on this, and obviously if the transaction doesn't support it, they're not going to be notifying anyone until later. You may not be able to give this heads up, but I will tell you that the industrial security representatives don't like to be surprised about transactions. So to the extent that it's feasible, just even a couple weeks, a few days, heads up, hey, this is happening, we're going to be submitting a change condition package, as soon as the transaction is complete. It goes a long way to sort of smoothing over that relationship. What goes into the change condition package? This is something that's filed, electronically in NIST. It's going to be done by the facility security officer, most likely. You're going to include a new SF-328 filing. You do it for both the highest tier cleared entity and as well as the highest tiered uncleared entity. So this is something that sometimes people, if they're unfamiliar with the government country, you're going to have to sort of collect the information going all the way up the chain, even to the entities that have no dealings at all with the cleared entity. But this is just to make sure that there's no foreign ownership, control, and influence concerns. You're going to have appropriate business documentation, list of the key management personnel, and stock ledgers. Any kind of affirmative answer, that means a yes as opposed to a no, on your SF-328 certificate pertaining to foreign interest is going to sort of trigger there's going to be a consideration as to whether or not there's foreign ownership, control, and influence concerns. So what are these triggers? What are the things to look for and to consider that, hey, we're going to need to head this off, we're going to need to address this? Greater than 5% foreign ownership. Organization as a whole owns greater than 10% of another foreign interest. You look at non-U.S. citizen directors, officers, and executives. Contracts, significant contracts with foreign persons, directors, officers, executives who serve on a foreign board, greater than 5% revenue from a single foreign person. These are kind of things that would trigger looking into foci concerns. And then once you've identified a potential foci concern, then you're looking at, okay, well, how do we get past this, right? It doesn't mean that you can't maintain the facility clearance, it just means that you might have to take certain actions to mitigate it. And this can be done through, just a board resolution. In particular, if the foreign entity doesn't own enough voting stock to put someone on the board, it can be done through a security control agreement. This is where they don't effectively own or control it, but maybe there is a foreign interest that has a rep on the board. Or you can go through and you can do a special security agreement or a proxy agreement, which is kind of like the most exclusion from the higher tiered entities. All right, pass this along.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm just going to quickly comment on this and give over to Brad. No government contractor M&A presentation would not be complete without talking about novations. But we're not going to talk about novations because novations haven't changed forever. It needs to be rewritten, needs to be reviewed. We need to think about it. But obviously, we have the Anti-Assignment Act that governs all of that. But novation is obviously a very important part of an asset deal. You need to be sensitive to novations because they can even arise, because some CEOs think a stock deal somehow requires a novation. At the end of the day, you got to figure out what to get the government when the government needs it so that it will recognize you on a post-close basis. We could talk about novations forever, right, Si? But I do think it's important. We've mentioned a couple of these before. These post-closing notices. I think this is an area where we can really help our clients is thinking through all the various types of notices that are required. And a lot of people forget about updating SAM. I mean, it's kind of basic and simple, but you're excited to close a deal and you forget to go in and change the things, even including, who now owns the entity, from the ownership perspective. So to keep that in mind when you're thinking about post-closing issues. So with our remaining time, I want to give it to Brad to kind of walk us through a topic that I think we're seeing obviously more and more in deals, and talk specifically about it in the GovCon space.
Yeah, so this is representations and warranties insurance. So all the parade of horribles and diligence issues that we've just frankly touched on today and haven't done the deep dive, all of those will make their way into the form of the purchase agreement. And there would be specific representations or at least indirect representations as to compliance. And so it's the task of the selling entity, the target company, to disclose things that they can't provide that representation to. So it says compliance with laws. If I haven't complied with laws, you should expect to see a corresponding disclosure on that topic. The sort of scary element of that forces the parties in the ordinary course to have to heavily negotiate these terms and conditions, these representations that are included in the purchase agreement. Insurance companies saw this, and they saw the amount of time and effort and, frankly, heated negotiations and warranties that the seller's making. And so it effectively transfers the risk of the transaction from the parties to the insurance company. And this is a product that has gained substantial steam over the years. I started working with underwriters 15 or 16 years ago, and there were just a handful of them in the marketplace. Now there are lots of underwriters. And it served to reduce the premiums. It's also served to kind of reallocate the leverage between the purchaser, the buyer company, and the insurance company as far as policy exclusions and things like that. Effectively, on behalf of the underwriters, I do diligence on top of the buyer's diligence. I want to make sure that the buyer adequately kicked the tires, has identified the issues, that anything that they've identified as an issue shows up in the disclosure schedule, and thereby I am able to protect my client, the insurance company, against a breach and ultimately a claim against the policy. Couple quick trends here. This slide shows sort of the increase in rep and warranty insurance underwriting efforts from 2019 to 2023 from one of kind of the big players in the market, Euclid. It shows 2021 as being the high water mark, and that's consistent with the information that Todd shared. The end of 2021, fourth quarter, was kind of the high water mark in particular. This next slide, and all of this is in your materials, I'd encourage you to take a look at it. The orange line at the top is the number of policy applications submitted. The silver line at the bottom is the number of policies actually underwritten. The blue bars are deal values, so you can sort of see an increase in enterprise value over time. We've got 4 minutes left. I wanted to share just some kind of insider tips and tricks, having worked in this space for a while. When I'm doing diligence on behalf of diligence on top of diligence, on behalf of these underwriters, you wouldn't be surprised how often it is where a significant volume of the revenue is derived from government work, prime, sub, federal, state, and local, but they have not involved a government contract specialist. They've done no diligence on any of these topics that we've touched on today. There's no section of their diligence memo that even addresses government contracts in any way, shape, or form. And that does obviously not give us the warm and fuzzy feeling as the underwriter. It's clear that the parties have viewed the purchase of this tool, rep and warranty insurance, as a proxy for adequate diligence, and thereby asked us to ensure a whole bunch of unknowns and uncertainties. And so some takeaways that I've learned over the years is involve a government contract specialist if it looks like a significant or even some portion of the target company's revenue is derived from government work. Have that specialist look at the majority, at least, of the active government contracts. Have that specialist prepare a diligence memo that's going to address the scope of the diligence questions, the responses that were received, the issues that were identified. And then by doing that, when we get on the call, and I asked Todd about his buy-side diligence, there's somebody that can sort of speak the same language as me. There's some evidence that the parties at least did something. And that's going to make the buyer in a much more favorable position to fight back against proposed exclusions that I might bring up. I just want to be clear also, the underwriters understand that this is a commodity. They ultimately want to sell this to the buyer, the purchaser of the policy. And so we're looking to close. We're not looking to sort of prevent the deal or mess up the timeline or anything like that. And that has become increasingly clear over the years as the marketplace for rep and warranty underwriters has expanded and the leverages sort of shift between the buyers and the insurance company. And there's clearly a recognition that diligence is not one size fits all. If the target company does one subcontract at the state and local level, that's different than, we're buying a division of a major defense contractor or something like that. And so there's an appreciation for that and an expectation that the level of diligence would be different. Trying to think if there are any other sort of high-level takeaways here.
Well, I'd just add, you've mentioned the diligence memo. Mm-hmm. I love rep and warranty insurance on a deal because that means I get to write a memo.
You get to write a memo?
It's brought back the memos.
Yeah, and so on the memo, I guess my input would be, explain the scope of the government contract portfolio. These guys are state and local only. They're subcontractor only. It's 5% of their total revenue. It's classified work, it's small business set-aside work, and then sort of sketch out the nature of your diligence exercise. We looked at all of the active contracts comprising 80% of the government contract revenue. We did an interview, we asked them these questions. Those questions are attached, the diligence tracker is attached to the memo. And so as I'm spending a little bit of time, and I'm doing 2 or 3 of these a week on average for these underwriters, it sort of just facilitates the process. So then I get on the underwriting call, and it's not just a bunch of pregnant pauses where the corporate guy's like, well, yeah, there is a consent requirement because our corporate associate reviewed the contracts, not feeling super comfortable about the level of diligence here.
That's like, I've had people who get rep and warranty insurance, we're on buy side, and they do try to pass it off a little bit or have less diligence. And I've told people, look, if you don't want us to do it, they're going to ask for a memo.
Yeah.
And they're going to ask detailed questions. We haven't done the work yet. We're going to have to do it later, and it's going to make you look bad to the insurance company.
It is, and I hate it personally because I effectively have to do buy-side diligence in a week on behalf of the underwriter because nobody else has done it. At the end of the day, we're insuring against breach of reps and warranties. So if you've identified an issue and it does not sort of make itself sort of listed, or there's not sort of a mirroring on the ultimate disclosure schedules, that's a red flag for me. So Todd does great diligence. He identifies that the contractor, feasts on small business set-aside works. The representation is, I've never done any small business set-aside opportunities. That schedule should be listed. There should be a whole list of contracts because Todd just said in his memo that that's what they do. If there's a disconnect there, we're going to have a discussion. Our time is up. Regrettably, I think we could spend multiple sessions on any one of these topics, but thankfully you do have the materials. Our contact information's there. Reach out if you have any questions or concerns. This is what we do all day, every day, so we're more than happy to help out.
Thank you.
So hello, everyone. My name is Travis Mooney, government contracts partner at Errant Fox. And I'm here joined by Todd Overman, Bass Berry, and we're both here to kind of answer questions that you have and to see if you had any further thoughts about the presentation, anything that kind of raised things in your mind that you'd like to know about. We did, I see, get one question in from Douglas Kornreich asking about sort of OCI issues. And so, he specifically asked, you mentioned private equity growth. We've had issues analyzing OCI issues with entities owned by private equity firms. Private equity firms argue that they are just investors and can't possibly provide all the affiliations. Any sense why all entities owned by a private equity firm wouldn't be considered in the same OCI umbrella? So I don't know if Todd's on, but I'll give my perspective on this. private equity firms, may take any level of ownership in a particular entity. They may have a majority ownership. They may be just making pure investment. So you have to look first at whether or not they actually are a majority owner. That could be considered a parent entity that might invoke a potential organizational conflict of interest concern. And then I would just say that even to the extent that there is majority ownership, because private equity companies tend to own sort of companies across a broad swath, this is something that's typically fairly easy to mitigate, even if there is any potential OCI concern. They can easily be walled off from specific information or precluded from, access to information that might be sensitive. I'll just say from my own perspective that we always do diligence OCI clauses and customer agreements to determine whether or not there might be an OCI concern, and that's always flagged up the chain as potential concern. So these issues are evaluated at the deal stage, and there are measures taken or put in place. And if there's a very significant organizational conflict of interest concern, it would be known about early and could be addressed at that point. So hopefully that answers your question, and we're happy to answer any furthers that anyone else might have. Anyone else? Todd, if you're there, did you want to just jump on and sort of introduce yourself?
Yeah, sorry. This is Todd Overman from Bass, Berry & Sims. And Travis, I could not have said it better myself. Completely agree with your response.
Good deal. Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I guess we can give you a little time back before the next session and turn it over. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you for joining us.
Thank you.
today. And thank you to our panelists for their presentations and live Q&A. And again, special thanks to our sponsors whose support made this event possible.